Tonight we're continuing. We're starting to get a little closer to the end of how to study the Bible. We had finished all the different types of figures of speech, the main ones, not all of them, but the main ones. And we had just started talking about how the Bible authorizes last week. And so we spent last Wednesday talking about commands and, what they basically were. And we talked about a number of types of commands. We talked about moral and religious commands, positive and negative commands, temporary and permanent commands. And then got down to the part about commands impart obligations. Now, this seems so obvious. I mean, it's just so obvious. When I was growing up, my dad gave me a command. It was obvious that I was obligated to do something. I mean, that's just, we might say, common sense. There's an obligation implied when someone gives you a command that has authority. Now, that person has to have authority before the command has any meaning, but there's an obligation implied when you're given a command. And throughout the Bible, I mean, from Genesis to Revelation, the Bible has all types of commands. But the idea basically comes down, again, to authority. Comes down to authority. What are we authorized to do and what are we not authorized to do? And the classic example, of course, of that is a parent giving maybe a younger person a list of things to get at the grocery store. Maybe it's a loaf of bread and a gallon of milk and a dozen eggs, and that's what it says on the list. And so the parent gives the younger person X amount of dollars to buy that, and they come back, and they bought the milk, dozen eggs, loaf of bread, bag of chips, package of cookies. What would the parent say? Would the parent say, "Good job"? If so, those were not the parents I was raised with. They authorized me to do something, didn't they? They authorized me to buy the bread, the milk, and the eggs. Period. And that was the end of the story. That was what was authorized. I wasn't authorized to buy anything else. Now, if they'd have said, "I'm giving you an extra $1 for you to spend on what you want," that's a different story. But if they said, "This is what I want you to buy, this, and this," and gave me money for that, it was very obvious what they meant. And so similarly, when commands are given, whether it was during the patriarchal age, the Mosaical age, or the age in which we're living, then those commands have obligations to them. And when we're authorized to do something through a command, that's what we're supposed to do. And again, it just seems to be common sense for us to do that. So, we come to the part that says commands impart obligations. Though commands impart obligations, it's important to know that some commands do not contain specific ways they're to be carried out, and others do. Let's go back to the grocery store. Now, if my parents would have said, "Get a loaf of bread," I would be free to get, sandwich bread, white bread, whole wheat bread, whatever, as long as it was a loaf of bread. But if they had just said, "I want you to get Colonial," I don't know if that's a brand of bread or not, whole wheat sandwich bread, then they specified what type of bread.
Colonial was a bread company.
Okay, that's good. Sounded familiar. It sounded breadish. That's what it sounded. It sounded breadish. Then it was specified. But if they had just said, "Buy a loaf of bread," then I could have got any type of bread I wanted and met the obligation. But when they specified, whole wheat or the brand or whatever, then I had to get that specific loaf of bread. Again, that just seems so obvious. Well, the Bible does the same thing. And he gives some examples of both of those types. So we're on our list. And of course, we tend to talk about Noah a lot because that's kind of an obvious example. Noah was given the command to build an ark. Now, God could have told him, I want you to build an ark. And if he didn't tell him anything else, Noah could have built any type of boat, basically, that he wanted. But of course, God gave some specifics about it. First of all, he gave the specific about what type of wood to use. He says, this is what I want you to make it out of. And then he told him how big to make it, didn't he? So Noah, when God told him how big to make the boat, the ark, Noah wasn't free to change the size of the ark. Wasn't authorized to change the wood that he used. And so God gave him some specific requirements about building the ark. What are some of the things God did not tell him about the ark? Think of some of the things God did not specify about building the ark. There's dozens of them, so just...
What kind of tools to use?
What kind of tools to use? Why, he could have used any type of tools he wanted. Any type. Because God didn't say, he said, I want you to build it, but he didn't say, you have to use this tool, that tool, and that tool, and that's it. He didn't do that. So he was given the command to build it out of the wood a certain size. But he didn't say what kind of tools. He didn't say who was to build it with him. He says, I want you to build an ark. In all likelihood, he probably used a bunch of people to build it. But he could have. He was authorized to build the ark. What else? Was he told where to build it? Nope. He was to build it out of certain wood, certain size. But he didn't say you had to build it on this spot. So Noah, through the command, was authorized to build it anywhere he wanted to build it. And so you could go on with a whole list of those things. And it's a good example. So some of the things were specified and some were not. So some of the things were authorized. And again, the type of tools to use were authorized in the sense that God told him to build it and he had to use tools. So therefore, he was authorized to use tools. But he was authorized to use any tools he wanted. And it makes a big difference when some of these examples that are with us in the gospel age now. The second one, when Jesus commanded the apostles to preach, he specified what they were to preach. He did not say, go into all the world and preach. That's not what it says. It says, go out to all the world and preach the gospel. Now it was specified what they were to preach. They weren't free to preach anything else other than the gospel because it was specified. What did he not specify about go into all the world and preach the gospel? That's right. And we see the wisdom of that, right? We see the wisdom of that. People in the first century, if we tried to explain TV, radio, and internet to them, they would think we're just as nuts as could be. So the means of doing it was not specified, and how wonderful that was. How awful it would have been if it, well, wouldn't, I'm not saying God would have done something awful, but imagine him saying, go into all the world by means of a donkey and preach the word, the gospel. Then we'd had to use a donkey. How awful that would have been. But it didn't do that. He authorized us to preach, and he authorized us what to preach, but he didn't say how you could do it. That's why we can use TV and radio today, or newspapers, or the internet, or whatever. We have authority to do that because it's involved in, it's part of, go into all the world and preach the gospel. That also authorizes us where to go. We can go anywhere in the world we want to go to preach the gospel. Anywhere. No exceptions. We can go into prisons. We can go in anywhere. We have God's authority to preach the gospel anywhere. The Lord's Supper. This is a really important one. We are commanded to partake of the Lord's Supper, aren't we? I mean, there's a number of places that mention the command to do that. Now, Christians are commanded to remember Christ's death in the Lord's Supper. Using the elements, bread and fruit of the vine, are required specifics. He told us what, right? When He said, remember my death, He was specific, wasn't it, in how He wanted to do that. Now, if He would have just said, I want you to remember my death, and that was it. Well, we could have done it any time we wanted to. We could have used any type of thing to remember His death if they wanted. I mean, we could have built an altar. We could have burnt wood on it. We could have done all kinds of things. But He was specific. He says, this is how I want you to remember my death. And then He was specific about it. He says, I want you to do it on the Lord's Day. Of course, that comes back to Acts chapter 20. And a number of places, like Matthew 26, but other places as well, mention bread, unleavened bread, and fruit of the vine. So He says, on the Lord's Day, I want you to partake of those two things for these reasons. And He says the bread represents the body, my body, on the cross. Fruit of the vine, my blood. As He calls it in Matthew 26, my blood of the new covenant. So He was specific about how He wanted us to remember His death. We were not given liberty to do it any way we wanted. He told us. But there's a lot of things about the Lord's Supper partaking of that He didn't tell us. For instance, give me one thing that He didn't tell us. What time of day? I can do it at 12:01. I can do it mid-morning. I can do it at noon. I can do it at 6 in the afternoon. It doesn't make any difference. But it has to be on the first day of the week. That was specified. What time of day was not. But again, think about the wisdom behind that. Think about the wisdom. Pardon?
The first day of the week was set down by the early church, wasn't it?
Set down by the early church?
Yeah, well, in Acts.
It's an example in the early church, yes. Yeah. Yes, it was. Absolutely.
The first day of the week was a custom.
That's right. In Acts chapter 20 and then in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. So we saw them doing it. It wasn't on the third day of the week, the sixth day of the week, the second day of the week. But we also see them doing it at different times on the first day of the week. So the time on the first day of the week is not important. The day of the week was specified. And again, we're authorized to use that unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine. We're not authorized to use anything else. So if we substitute, going back to like the Nadab and Abihu example, if we substitute something strange for it, then we're doing something unauthorized. We're doing something unauthorized. So the Lord's Supper then, of course nowadays religious groups, they'll partake of it on Saturday, they'll partake of it on holidays regardless of when they fall. None of those are authorized at all. So if anybody does that, they're doing something not authorized. Just like me buying cookies or chips or gum, candy, without authority. Well, I would pay for it. Well, that's how God feels. It's exactly how God feels. So, Lord's Supper, very, very important. And I think he mentions a few more here. Let's see. The ark, we talked about the apostles. We talked about those. Observing the Lord's Supper. Oh, one thing about the Lord's Supper. How we distribute the elements are not specified. In other words, on the first day of the week, during the assembly, we could do it the very first thing. And as was the custom in some places, you could come up and partake of it and then go to your seat and sit, right? You could do that. because you're partaking of the bread and the fruit of the vine on the first day of the week. Now that may not be very convenient, but there's nothing wrong with it because it's authorized in partaking of the Lord's Supper. As long as it's the first day of the week, like the early church did it, and as long as it's those two elements, because they have specific purposes. The unleavened bread, Jesus said, represented something. His body. The fruit of the vine represented something. His blood. So see, they were symbolic. There was something spiritual behind the elements that He chose. Something spiritual. So, very, very, very important concept. Right there. All right. The next thing are, we have 6 or 7 minutes, examples. Examples. And what do they do for us? It was always brought up about examples of the early church.
Give us a pattern to follow.
Gives us a pattern. So we go to the Bible. Now we know from a number of places, like in Romans and in 1 Corinthians, that things done in the past, patriarchal period, Mosaical period, were written for our learning, right? They're examples for us in the sense of we can see spiritual applications to certain concepts like you shall have no other gods before me. We can see how people applied that in their lives. And of course that's just one example of many. So, for the Christian system, examples recorded in the New Testament serve as patterns left by early Christians. They illustrate how Christianity was taught and practiced. They're valuable models. They illustrate approved practices that David brought up. But examples of themselves are not binding. And this is what he means by that. You can't just go find anything in the New Testament and say, oh, well, somebody did that, then I have to do it. We look at where many of the people were baptized. A lot of them were baptized in the Jordan River. Well, there's an example, but is it binding? Well, of course not. How could millions and millions of people all over the world get to the Jordan River? Some of them would probably die getting there. So you have to look at examples just like that to see if there's some spiritual principle that's taught that's behind it. You've heard me mention before that there are some churches that partake of the Lord's Supper in an upper room. They will not partake of it on the ground floor. Because they believe the partaking of it in the upper room like Jesus and the disciples did on that Friday before He was crucified is a binding practice. But if you were to ask them, what's the spiritual principle behind partaking of it on the upper floor, they would not be able to tell you an answer. Because there isn't one. So that's why when you say you can't just take any example in the Bible and say that it's binding. You have to look to see what is the principle that's being taught by it. Most of the Christians in the first century did not meet in church houses. Buildings, whatever we want to call them. Well, does that mean that we can't? Do we have to meet in people's houses? Well, that's an example of what they did. But is there a spiritual principle behind meeting in a person's house as opposed to meeting in a bigger building? Well, of course not. So again, you have to look at the principle behind those examples. Remember Lydia and her household, they were praying where? Down by the river. Well, is that where we have to pray? It's an example. Well, of course not. So, when we talk about examples not being binding, not every activity or action in the New Testament is something we have to do. We don't have to do it like that. So you have to look at the principle behind it. So when he talks about in the second paragraph, they either give support for what's otherwise been required, or they provide authority for things that are optional. And I'll show you what, I don't know if we'll get to it tonight, but we'll talk about some of those examples. So he says, some examples illustrate essential matters. That is, they demonstrate things which are found to be required elsewhere in the Scriptures. Other examples illustrate optional matters. That is, they demonstrate things which have not been required and are matters of expediency. For instance, let's go back to Acts chapter 20. When Paul was preaching, he preached until midnight. Now, that's an example of what the early church did, right? But it's not binding that we have to preach that long. Surprised there wasn't a glory hallelujah there, David. But see, that's what I'm talking about. You have to look at the spiritual principle, the command that example is illustrating, to know whether it's something required of us today. Because as you look out into the religious world, I mean, everything imaginable has been used as an example for us that we're supposed to do. I mean, you could just about pick anything on any page of the New Testament, and somebody somewhere teaches that that's something you have to do. So therein lies our responsibility to see whether this is something that is binding upon us. But the important thing is, why is it binding on us? That takes effort, that takes study, that takes energy, that takes time. And again, we could look at countless examples, and we'll look at a number of them next week, again, because we're about out of time. But examples do both of those things. They either illustrate some essential commandment or requirement, or they show how something was done. That latter category, when Paul went on his missionary journeys, he was carrying out the commandment to go into all the world and preach the gospel. Now, examples. Sometimes he walked. Sometimes he took a boat. Those are examples of how he carried out the command. But me walking is not a requirement. Me taking a boat is not a binding example. But preaching the gospel is. And that's, of course, is what's important. Okay, well, why don't we stop there, and that'll be a good place to start looking at examples of examples for next Wednesday evening.